The Marching Roundtable's appearance at Carolina Crown Spring Training was made possible by Fred J. Miller Incorporated, found at fjminc.com.
Hey everybody, this is Tim Hinton. I am at spring training at Carolina Crown. I'm talking to this wonderful guy again, Rick Subel. How are you?
I'm doing great.
So you're going to give me some inside scoop about the show, how it was put together, some of the ideas behind it. I think you that are watching will really appreciate this because we love the productions that we see Drum Corps do, but these interviews that I'm trying to do in the summer are to give people more insight into why choices were made. What is the thought process behind the choices they made? What does the show mean on levels I may not get the first time I see it? I think this is interesting stuff. I hope that people do. So I know that when you're designing these shows, a lot of thought goes into them.
Oh, absolutely.
So I'm anxious to hear some of the ideas behind it, beneath the surface of the show, shall we say.
We can go deep behind that.
Which is the name of the Crown Show, as you guys all know, Beneath the Surface. Show is wonderful. I love the music. I can't wait to hear more about it. So let's maybe start with how this idea where the idea came from?
Yeah.
Where you came up with all this. I think that's interesting for people to know too.
Yes. Well, I kind of mentioned it in an earlier interview about, my role is to bring the design team together and to foster lots of communication and what if scenarios and, listen to someone's idea. And it's always a yes and kind of approach with regard to that. And I feel like for a design team, you get a really original product because, if it was singular sided, it would just be another version of myself. But now it's a version of myself with Michael Klesch and Jeff Sacktig and Jim Ancona and Jim Coates and everybody on the design team. So, we start every season with just a recap of last year. What did we do last year? What would we like to do more of or less or differently this year? So we started with this.
Wait a minute. I want to highlight that. Do you guys get that? Even at the highest level, they look at the end of the season and are like, what went well, what didn't go well? Reevaluating your season. I'm sorry to interrupt. But I think that's really interesting that you guys did that too. Mm-hmm. So anyway, so you what can you share with us some of the things you thought about after last season?
Yeah. I mean,
not to get too into the weeds, but some of the ideas.
I think you have to because, let's say as an artist, and I try not to air quote it because I feel like we really do devote a lot of our time to the artistry of this activity. But as an artist, you can sometimes fall victim to repetition if you just go into it and say, well, that worked, let's do it again, and, for us specifically, there was some things, we wanted to imbue the show with more thematic content from a sound design standpoint. We wanted to bring the front ensemble into the visual look of the field and into play with other staging elements and, use on-field location-based microphones and, be able to use different facets of the field and props that would cause us to stage and design in a different way that would be less freeing and complicated sometimes, but it would force us to think about the choices that we make, And so we just knew in the beginning there were some logistics that we wanted to explore and in a positive way. And so with regard to that, we sit down and we do all of that first, and then as we are away from each other, I start to think about just what is an aesthetic direction? What's a good jumping off point and starting point for that very first design conversation? One of the key elements of this particular team and Michael Klesch and Jeff Sacktig and Tom Hannum and Jim Ancona is the level of complexity that they're able to work in, but also create immense clarity in design, and that word clarity really stuck out to me. So much of what we do is a first read, someone sees it one time. And so, with regard to clarity, I knew that I wanted a souped up version of that. I wanted it to be as complex as heck, but I wanted it to be able to be digested so very clearly. And so I started that conversation with them. Clarity, see through, what's behind something, what's beneath something, layers of things. And in that discussion, Tom Hannum produced a piece for us to listen to, called Beneath the Surface or something of that nature. And so that the feeling of those words beneath the surface stuck with us as a starting point. Okay, well, what does that mean? From a personality standpoint, perhaps, in our lives, what people see in the front of us is the first thing that they know about us. But there's a plethora of stories and depth to every single person. And so this idea of stripping away a facade to get to something that's really authentic and unique then became sort of an emotional context for us. What does that feel like and look like and sound like? And how the performers portray that,
So, all right, so that's really interesting. So sorry to interrupt you, but okay, so there's two levels to this that I think are interesting. One is you're saying you have a design team of really smart people, and I would actually, looking at your team, I would completely agree with the way you just said that. They have this incredibly talented, very complex stuff, and they have a way of making it super clear. In fact, clarity is a buzzword, in our activity. Anyway,
Right.
People talk about that a lot. I did a webinar this winter at Marching Arts Education about creating clarity, finding clarity. It's hard. That's sort of our goal.
Yeah.
Is, can people clearly see our idea? Can people clearly understand what we're trying to say? So I love the idea that you have all these really smart people creating something very clear, but then for us to maybe say, well, what's behind that?
Yeah.
What's beneath? How are they? Like, to me, this is what I think is interesting about having these conversations. How are all those really smart people able to create that clarity and look behind it? So I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
So that you're doing that and you're sort of letting us see through. So I like the idea. That's sort of like the point of this conversation.
Yeah.
Is you're helping me
look.
see, how did you get that clarity? How do you guys create those sounds, that clear visual? What's behind that? I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's part of what I do.
Yeah.
So I love that you're talking about that. And then adding the emotional standpoint too, that's another layer.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Well, on top of all that, we knew that we needed or wanted, what is that strong piece beneath the surface when we get to that. And the idea of sacred geometry was something that I mentioned to everybody and just said, there's sort of a study, or maybe it's a cult study, I don't know, but it's a wondering about the connective patterns, repetition of, down to the cellular microscopic level. But if you were to read up on, the Fibonacci sequence of numbers and, what he started as a study in, rabbit populations, like the exponential growth in rabbit populations was drawn out into a sequence and an equation that when you chart it out becomes this sort of spiral shape, that people started to notice, or you see that naturally in like the inside of a shell, and so.
Well, I think people are familiar with that in science. There's that sort of, I think of it like as a nautilus shape.
Yeah, the nautilus shell.
That nautilus shell shape, like that. Do you have a picture? Do you want to
Yeah,
show
I
it?
do.
Okay, so here's some examples that you've got visuals that are on your screen I'm going to share.
Yeah. So, like the idea, the concept of beneath the surface, even something simple like a glacier, we often say, you only 10% of it is above the surface and there's so much more beneath,
right?
Just in terms of like depth. But, the charting of the Fibonacci sequence of numbers creates this sort of spiral, this perfect sort of proportionate spiral.
Yeah, we were all familiar with that from what is like science, basically. Science and math,
yeah.
Right? Basically have found that. Yeah.
And that golden ratio is like found naturally, like inside of the nautilus shell. So with the idea of sacred geometry, it's asking those questions about what is the mathematical connection of all of these things that just happen naturally, and early human cultures borrowing from those natural organic shapes that they find, they use to recreate the pyramids, and there's just this very strong what we now would call like Platonic solids, are the building blocks of a lot of art and architecture and building blocks of organic life in general.
So this is sort of what you're saying is this is sort of behind this. This is sort of behind the surface of things that are in the natural world, in science, that scientists and mathematicians have discovered.
If you look deeper, if you look at a rose, you can appreciate its value from just a first glance, but to see the patterns of how the petals bloom and what you could find the seed of life shape in sacred geometry. Right. It's just kind of noticing those patterns and those series of just natural happenings of things that can be mathematically defined through shape.
So it's interesting that you went to this sort of cerebral, scientific, mathematical place. But that makes sense. I mean, music is mathematical, marching is mathematical.
All of this is.
Yeah.
You think about music in general, it's just vibrations. It's vibrations sent, it's vibrations carried through the air, it's vibrations received. So how do we get emotion from that,
Very
and so
cool.
we scientifically, basically, through chord progressions and melodic notation, and the performer, imbues it with a certain level of air quality, which we might call emotion, It creates emotion out of that. Colors do that, shapes do that. motion of the staging and how things, are wild and frenzied and lock into place. They create those certain effects. And so basically we're using the math of design to design,
No, it's cool. And that's what's behind beneath the surface of designing a marching show.
Absolutely. And like I said, the original intent was to make the surface level as clear as possible, to be able to enjoy it without knowing any of those things,
But then you can look beneath the surface and learn more. That's really interesting.
Well, and there's some other little sneaky things. The Greek symbol for lambda is sort of this upside down triangle, and as you'll see, the triangle shape is pretty prominent in the show. So the 30 is important just because it's the 30th anniversary of the drum corps, and so it's a hidden thing versus it just kind of being like, hey, everybody, we're 30,
But again, we're talking about things that are beneath the surface of designing a show that if I know it, then I can enjoy the show more.
Right, and there might be some throwback type things. If you look deep enough and see, you might see a choreographic thing, perhaps in the color guard, or a staging thing,
I think we're getting some hints, people. I think
you
we're
never
getting some
know.
hints. All right, I love that.
Know, but that's the fun stuff that, you can be geeky over and watch it over and over again and see something that you've never seen before. And so I think,
very interesting.
As we do a lot of shows over the summertime, I think that's what's fun is there's more to see every time you see it, something deeper every time.
What's beneath the surface of the show? I love it.
Yeah. So that's the concept. So it's a little bit harder to kind of explain than just like birds and feathers and flocking and that. Right. So it's a little bit deeper than that, but we use that as an inspiration, and then we take that and craft our own design into it, in and around that.
Really, really interesting stuff.
Yeah. I mentioned before, starting logistically, we scripted out the program exactly, like no more.
So wait, this is interesting to me. You started the process by mapping out the concept, and then you went to find music.
Well, in this particular concept, we're working from the surface level to the...
Are you okay if I show that document?
That's what I'm looking at real quick. And there's no swear words on there.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I just didn't know if you wanted people to see it, actually.
You can. I mean, it'll kind of be after we've released everything, so yeah, we're good.
Hang on a minute. Is there more you want to show me on the screen?
Well, yeah. Well, like when I've done stuff for WGI like this, Carl likes it for me to show this because it actually is something that people can borrow.
Is it a document that I could share?
I could give you a portion of it, yeah.
Okay, if you could share, we're obviously going to edit this part out, but if you could share with me a document that shows some of these basic ideas that we could share, I think that people would love to see that.
Yeah. Well, so like what this is our design document. Everything that we've talked about, everything.
All right, are you seeing this? Like, this is really complicated. Tons and tons of pages of thoughtful things about the show. This is how you started the process?
Well, yeah.
Or part of the process?
Well, this is my personal way to do like a design board, and you ask like what are all the things that you do. I try to keep it all together in one place. Any videos to about sonic geometry, which is a whole other conversation about vibration and the tuning to 440 and all of that kind of stuff, but just to make it accessible for the rest of the staff. If Jeff needs to find something, he can click on visual production notes right here off of the document and go straight to the information that the battery percussion put in visual notes for the closer, kind of stuff. So part of the job is just collecting all of the information and seeing all of the inspiration in one place, as a reference every time we go back to it, instead of just searching through 1,000 emails and text messages and whatnot.
So you have a show document that clearly sort of lays out all of these ideas you're playing with. Mm-hmm. Then somehow this turns into a show that we can just enjoy, or we can look beneath the surface.
Yeah, you channel it. I learned that from I forget the name of it. It's a Twyla Tharp book about her design process, where she called it boxes. She collects things in boxes, and then you go through the box and organize that as you put your art together, And so it kind of does that, all of the brainstorming things, we put it in, and then as we discuss more and things take more shape, and the ideas that stick with you are there, and then I start to formulate that into clear places in the document. You weed away the things that are distractive, or we're not going to really use that. Sure. But that ultimately turns into a script. We scripted out the show, how we wanted to lay out, what we wanted it to do, the first minute of the program. Did we want to have a 30-second ambient, atmospheric build up into a thing, or in this particular show, I don't want to give it away, but it gets you right off the beginning. It's very clear. It's very clear on the surface how we want it to start, and so we script it out, and then as we're looking for pieces of music that do that, it's almost curated rather than than just decided. There wasn't a piece of music that we said, oh, well, there's clear in the title of this one, so we're going to try to use that. We really wanted to know how we wanted those 2.5 minutes of the show to feel, and how to feature the front ensemble, or all of those notes. We tried to line it up so that way, as the music team is brainstorming music, they're seeing it while they're hearing it, and then knowing that it's going to do a specific thing and play a certain role. And all of the pieces of music do go through stages. There's 4 parts of the program. There's the on the surface opening, and how we journey to part 4. It is a process you can follow. It's very much a stripping down of layers by the time that we get to the end. What feels like the grand facade of power drum corps becomes a very individualized and neat thing. There's this sort of teasing world music thing under the surface of everything that finally takes over by the end, and it becomes this sort of red hot production number. And
so what does the world music angle have to do with the concept?
Well, we liked the idea of of voice, because it's the original instrument. When you think about sacred geometry, you think about the thousands of years of the looking at and figuring out, the wonders of life that way. And so, it was a very grounding feel to us. Now, the whole show doesn't feel like that, but it is an inspiration that you can feel growing throughout the whole course of the program and how it evolves.
Interesting.
So it strips down from like one thing to become something else by the end, So the sound design really does carry us through the evolution of the program, and
that includes that world music feel. I love the idea of the original instrument with a voice.
And just cool. How it, from huge choral feeling things to intimate small things, into a speaking thing, or just a chatter of a whisper. The voice element in the sound design sort of gives us the beneath the surface guide, I guess.
Very, very interesting. So I love the idea that, okay, we have this basic show, we have this concept of seeing beneath the surface, and then you went with a lot of these sort of basic mathematical, musical, scientific things that we can find pieces of, or images of, or ideas about within the design of the show. So it'll be fun for me, maybe on the second or third time, to watch for these things you're describing.
Absolutely.
Those sounds, or those images, or those shapes.
There's obviously a few Jeff Sacktig moments of wild, crazy drill patterns that are not just random patterns, but they're specific.
It's drum corps.
You gotta have them. But he was able to do that in this very specific version of the seed of life opens to the flower of life, and so there's this evolutionary sacred geometry. Geometry obviously is a specialty of Jeff Sacktig, and the ability to do that. But aside from that, the equation-like approach, it all revolves around just the design tools, the science of design, balance and proportion and scale and density, and sequential motion versus unison motion versus layered motion. So I would think that from beginning to end, it feels like we've exploited all of the possible tools of design for pageantry.
It's really interesting. And when I had the conversation with Jeff, he talked a little bit about this and how he's a mathematician. He starts from a very mathematical place, which is great for drill designers. I wish I was a mathematician, because I struggle. Well, I write drill from a different kind of place. But it was interesting. He mentioned sort of these things. So if you haven't seen my conversation with Jeff, make sure you check that out. So I want to ask you, Gabriel's Oboe, so wonderful that you included that in the show. People loved it. Everybody loves this song. I've had so many people in my life tell me it's their favorite song. So it seems like, now that we've heard it, it seems like the perfect crown ballad. So where did that come from? Who brought that to the table? How did that get included? Because I think that even though we're talking at spring training, when people have already seen the show, I think when they watch this conversation, I think it's going to be very, very popular this summer. People are going to love hearing the Crown brass line play that song.
It's scrumptious.
And Michael Klesch's arrangement is just spectacular. But how did that come? I love that that's in the show.
Well, we got there, once in scripting the show, we knew that in the four walls of surface that get broken down, the first being the stoic presentational self, the second being more of group personality, the third was a very spiritual awakening that causes a change to really become an authentic self by the end. If we're speaking in terms of the authentic self or the authentic design,
sort of on that emotional journey you've been talking about.
Yeah, that's the emotional journey. So there isn't a very reverent awakening, recognizing the sacred patterns and just, embracing the connections to all of these other things, in that sacred geometry type way. We wanted to do something very intimate and very moving, but also very reverent and very soulful. And very, the awakening of the show happens there, and a large change happens after that. And so I think it's going to do that. Yeah. I pitched the piece to Michael because I love it. I've always wanted to do it, and it's like you said, you dream about hearing the Crown Hornline play that, and Now that we kind of knew what we wanted that portion of the show to really do, the more we listened to it, we said, okay, this could be awesome, and his treatment of it with the sparseness and
so beautiful. So beautiful.
I just got super excited, but we wanted to create that just stillness and emptiness that causes people to lean forward.
This is what I want you guys to notice is that when that moment happens and you're hearing the Crown Hornline play it, notice that it is just the hornline. It is just very pure, sort of gutsy way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
There's it's not a lot of stuff in the background or anything. It's just like purely the hornline, and it is gorgeous. And we all want to hear the Crown Hornline.
When I mentioned about it, just exploiting the tools of design, I mean, it's a miraculous dynamic contrast.
Right, but that's talk about clarity.
Absolutely.
And talk about all the forces we have. Shows can be so noisy that I just thrill
cluttered.
Oh yeah, it's like a cacophony a lot of the times, and part of that's really fun. But I love that you guys are sort of stripping that down, and for this moment, you're giving us just here's the horn line, here's this. There's everything else is out of the way. There's this clarity as you're discussing. I think it's a thrilling moment.
Well, and for us to really allow the color guard to have almost a whole production of them.
They have that all that space.
Absolutely.
It's just beautiful.
The guard does some interesting, very, interesting choreographed interplay with these plexiglass pieces that are really unique. See-through flags and a development of color process with that. And,
cool.
The horns come in and you see this flood of flags and dance and drama and pageantry, and it all kind of buttons itself up with a perfect golden ratio. And I think it's really fun.
I love it.
It still has that math approach, but in a very spiritual and emotional way.
Well, there's a lot of depth to the show. There's a lot of thought that's gone into it. So look beneath the surface of all shows, but I'm glad that you gave us some information what's beneath the surface of your show.
Absolutely.
About being beneath the surface.
Anytime.
I love it. Really great. And the costuming, which we can see through, you can see beneath that. It's all super smart. Congratulations. It's a great show.
Thank you. We love it.
Thanks, everybody, for watching.
Bye, everybody.
Find other interviews and videos from top DCI designers, instructors, and marchers, behind-the-scenes videos, interviews, and podcasts from winter camps, spring training, traveling during the season, and performances, all at marchingartseducation.com/DCI-2019. The Marching Roundtable is proud to be an official media partner of Drum Corps International.